and get started. So welcome to the Open Gov Hub. Just want to thank you all for being with us today. I think all of you have probably been here before, but just as a quick intro, my name is Neda. I'm the manager here. And the Open Gov Hub is a co-working community as well as a network of almost 40 organizations who are all promoting open government reforms around the world. And we exist to help these organizations get their work done by sharing resources, but also to work together to have greater impact and have a regular brown bag series, which is one of the ways that we try to accomplish that. So really happy to have the OGP, Open Government Partnership, as well as some of our other member organizations speaking today about reflecting on the first 5 years of the Open Government Partnership and also thinking specifically about the summit. So with that, I'll hand it over to Joe Fody. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So I'm Joe Fody. I am from the independent reporting mechanism of the Open Government Partnership, and we're streaming this on Facebook Live for some people who are joining us remotely. So if you have comments, questions, make sure you speak up. We'll move the camera over here so it can be seen for everyone. Basically going to break today up into 3 parts. Real quick, I'm going to show you some trends in OGP. What's going on, what's not going on, so we know where we're improving as an organization or as a community, and where we're not. And then we're going to Joe Powell is going to go through some summit highlights outside of what's going on in OGP action plans. And then we have folks from different organizations in the room who are going to be at the summit and talk about what they're planning on getting from the summit. This PowerPoint that I'm about to give is for the people joining us by Facebook Live. We're going to put the link up there, so you should be able to download this PowerPoint as you wish. Great. So real quick, let me run through some OGP trends. What's going on in OGP so that we're focusing on some empirics. So what we've done in the independent reporting mechanism is we've summarized what the first 3 or 4 years of action plans got us. So this is really going up to 2014, 2015, which is a large bulk of action plans that we can compare. And it's the first time we can see how governments are doing from their first to their second action plans, where the improvements are, where they are not. This gives us some empirics in which to ground various advocacy and area work that people are doing. So real quick, let's talk about the OGP process. The OGP process requires governments to have participatory inputs from the public, from civil society organizations in order to come up with action plans. There are 6 requirements in the formations of action plans. Out of those 6, most countries are improving in these basic requirements. These are things like publishing a timeline of how to participate. They are putting out a summary of public comments. In general, you can see most of these countries in green improved from the first to second action plan. A few declined. Why? Each one is an interesting story. But the general story here is that the formal requirements of participation, we see greater compliance. Where did we actually see a decline over this period? Actually, generally, we saw improvements. These are the 6 requirements here. As usual, they don't quite show up properly, but you have advance notice, awareness-raising activities of how to participate, in-person consultation, summary of comments published. Across the board, we saw improvements in all of these areas, although some of them are still fairly low. Putting out a timeline of participation, still less than half the countries did that, as an example. But again, and then we saw the one area where there was a decline in this period was ongoing public monitoring and collaboration in the implementation of the action plan, which is interesting because that's been one of the areas where there's been a big push over the last year or so to get governments to put up permanent dialogue mechanisms in OGP where civil society can participate. So again, this is data from 2014 and the first half of 2015. So I hope that when we come back in 2 years, that last orange bit will be much improved. You're saying to yourself, well, that's just very formal tick box kind of requirements for public participation. You're probably right. So what level of input did the public actually have in action plans? You can see there's a small group of countries that had no consultation at all in their action plans. You can see that there is out of 49 action plans that we looked at recently, a few of them don't really have participation, they just have public information sessions. A large number of them had what we would call consult, where they asked the public to give their opinion, but there was no feedback loop from the government. There was basically, it was you have your chance to give your input, but we don't necessarily tell you how your input affected the action plan, if at all. A smaller group had dialogue, and an even smaller group, which we say under involved, an even smaller group using this scale collaborated, meaning that the public could help to set the agenda and could help to inform how the commitments came out. When we move to the ongoing consultation, you see that it worsens, of course, because the largest group of countries had no consultation during the action plan at all. So there's a big area for improvement. Hopefully, over the last year, again, given the time lag, this is improving. We know, as OGP staff, that this is a big area to invest in. That's it for the process. Let's go on to what's actually in those action plans. What reforms are being taken? It's important to place where we were at the London summit when we were first measuring action plans, as we didn't even know how many commitments were in action plans. We didn't have government points of contact for those action plans. We didn't have basic requirements. A lot of the commitments were so vague you couldn't read them. A lot of them were e-government commitments, or they were just nice things to have. They were public goods, but they weren't necessarily opening government. They were not improving access to information. They were not improving public participation. They weren't making officials or decision makers accountable to the public. So this was really a big focus in the last few years, is to get action plans just to a basic level there. So how do we do? And here, this is the overall assessment. Sorry, this is these are called starred commitments. They have to meet these 4 requirements. They must be clear enough to be measured or to be assessed. They must be relevant to open government. They must be complete or on their way to completion, and they should be adequately ambitious to have a big potential impact on government. 2 things I would want you to see from here. In the most recent assessments of each of these countries, big things are the average is about a little bit less than 1 star per country, which is probably too low. That means it's a big reform that's actually getting complete. And most countries don't have stars. I don't know how many stars each action plan should have, but I could say that too few countries have big commitments that are getting done at this point. I don't know if 1's the right number, that every country should have 1 or every country should have 3. That's for other people to decide. This is not to say that these countries did not do meaningful, important reforms, and it's important to remember that this was at the midterm of their last assessment, so hopefully this number goes up. But it's obviously too low right now. Why did they not receive them? What are the biggest problems with not getting starred commitments, as the IRM calls them? If you go to the right here, and you have to read right to left, the first reason, 17% of commitments in OGP just weren't even specific enough to be assessed overall. An additional 11% were not clearly relevant to open government. And then the biggest chunk, as you can see here, is that a lot of them didn't have high enough potential impact. So if there's one thing you take away from this graph here, one thing is, one of the biggest barriers to having really ambitious reforms in OGP is that governments are not articulating those ambitious reforms in OGP. So it's really important for us to state those. Let's zoom in here. When we zoom in on the completion rates, you can see it's almost the same at 61% of the remaining commitments that were ambitious, that were specific, that were relevant, didn't get done in the first year. Obviously, a lot of them might get done in the second year, but this is the second big barrier. So if there's 2 things you can take away from OGP and where we're at, it's that we need more ambitious commitments, and we need to focus on implementation now. And I'll show you where we've put energy real quick. These are improvements from the first action plan to the second action plan along those 4 dimensions. So if you can believe it, 2 years ago, 29% of commitments were not specific enough to be measured, which is a huge amount, nearly a third. That's declined to 8% now. So you see these 71 and 92 figures. So action plans are much better written now than they used to be. That's no longer the major barrier for governments. Same thing with relevance. We're not seeing the same amount of e-government commitments, of just good things, public good commitments. They're much more focused on open government now, so there's much more understanding in the community about what open government is. Where do we see declines is on the potential impact. Governments are making less ambitious commitments. Now, this could be because they overshot on their first action plan and decided to scale back on the second action plan. It could be because the IRM is getting stricter. Those are the 2 main hypotheses I could offer there. We actually see, interestingly, an increase in the rate of completion, a statistically significant increase in the rate of completion. But it's still not as high as we would like it to be. So this is just looking at the action plans that have the countries that have 2 action plans. Okay, so the focus here is that what I hope you take away from this about where OGP is at is people are no longer debating what is the definition of open government. It seems that a consensus is emerging. Now the challenge is, how do you encourage positive risk-taking on the part of governments, and how do you support that implementation there? And so this brings us into the summit, and what we can hopefully get from it is really raising the collective ambition of OGP, and then making sure that we're bridging that last gap of implementation. So real quick, there are things that I would say from the action plan only perspective we can look at. At this summit, Joe will probably talk about this. Hopefully the steering committee will be adopting much more ambitious, more substantive and meaningful participation guidelines. So we know there aren't as many managed public participation processes in countries. Again, the IRM will probably track participation quality much more closely based on those guidelines. And then in terms of improving OGP commitments, we really need to focus on how to get that potential impact up, and also for governments themselves to better explain what is their policy trying to solve. One of the complaints about OGP is sometimes they're solutions in search of problems. People want to build a new platform, website, but they can't, but they haven't figured out what problem in the real world they're actually trying to solve with this open government intervention. We need to be able to better describe those and articulate those challenges. Some have pushed for earlier review to improve specificity and relevance. Some have actually pushed for longer review, that the IRM should take a 3 or 4, 5-year view of OGP. And then better support for implementation, whether that's from civil society or the support unit or peer pressure. But Joe will talk about all of those, and I'm going to stop here.
Okay.
I just have a black slide.
Thanks, Joe. I think the speech and preview we would have given on the OGP summit 3 or 4 weeks ago would have been very different to the one we can give today. So I think one message and thing I'd like to focus on for this group is what in the next 2 weeks, with 2 weeks to go, can we collectively focus on as a community to increase the chances of success of a major gathering of heads of state, ministers and civil society leaders from around the world that coincidentally is happening just a few weeks after major political upheavals here. It's happening in France. If those of you following the opinion polls in France will have seen over the weekend Marine Le Pen leading in some versions against some constellation of candidates. We'll see what the result yesterday affects that, how that affects that. So I just wanted to focus my comments on, at the start of the year when the French government said they wanted to host an OGP summit in 2016, we very much wanted to build in this learning that is coming up from all of the countries that Joe has presented. So we really wanted to focus on ambition, how do we get more ambitious commitments, and implementation. How do we actually raise the credible implementation of OGP commitments so we don't see this big fall off that Joe showed us. I think where we are now is that the summit is also becoming a far bigger geopolitical moment for us as an open government community. There are already confirmed 15 heads of state, vice presidents, prime ministers, 11 leaders of subnational entities, mayors, governors, and members of parliament, over 40 ministers from different countries. This will be by far and away the biggest political gathering of OGP that we've had to date. So the first message I'd just like to leave the room with is how do we use that grouping? How do we use the fact that politicians are coming together in these numbers and maximise it? We do not want to leave Paris with people having a perception that it was a talking shop, that people were not delivering substantive remarks or making substantive commitments to the movement. So I would really love to hear from you any ideas you have on how we maximise this as a geopolitical moment. The second thing we have, and this talks to Joe's point on collective ambition and commitments. The French government have been leading a process of creating a Paris Declaration on open government. And they've been very open about co-creating this. It's actually online for those of you who would have seen it already. It's available online. We can maybe share it in the comments on the Facebook group. And what that does is two things. One, it will have a high-level statement that recognises the geopolitical context we're in, that positions open government as the strongest alternative to authoritarianism, to closing civic space, to attacks on freedom of the press, to the types of trends that Civic has outlined are happening in 109 countries globally at the moment, where space is actually reducing for civil society, including in some OGP countries. So we'll have a high-level statement that positions OGP very firmly on that, and then we'll have 21 collective actions where we're looking for a combination of government and civil society organisations who are the trailblazers or the leaders on particular open government topics. So, for example, on open contracting, we're hoping to see governments join what is called the C5 of Colombia, UK, France and others, to actually join together and have a bigger group, a bigger coalition around open contracting in OGP. Similarly on beneficial ownership, on freedom of information laws, on various different types of open data commitments, on climate data and climate risk data. So we through the steering committee of OGP, have identified 21 areas where we think there is potential to bring these countries and civil society organisations together. But we really need the help of all of you and of civil society globally to see this summit as a major advocacy opportunity for you to push governments to go further than they would have done otherwise, and to commit to a direction of travel in Paris that may result in more ambitious OGP National Action Plan commitments in future. So the second thing, that we have the high-level leaders, we need to maximise them. The second thing is we need to maximise the advocacy opportunity of the Paris Declaration. The third thing, and then we'll open it up, is we're also using this 5-year moment to use it as a learning moment and actually have a refresh of what OGP's strategy will look like as a kind of vision for the next 5 years. And obviously, many of you have already been involved in consultations that we've had at the IODC in Madrid, in New York, online in various places. Many of you have given us fantastic ideas. We want to use Paris to present back what we've heard and outline 5 or 6 areas where we feel collectively, as an open government movement, we need to deepen our focus and attention. Clearly, some of those have been brought into even sharper focus by the last few weeks around citizen engagement, civic trust in government, how we do much more deeper forms of participation, as Joe said, getting beyond transactional consultation processes to something that's much more meaningful and responsive. So there'll be a set of things where we're looking for the community to tell us, are these strategic directions that we're presenting back to you, do they feel right? And what is each of our role in actually helping make them happen? What is the role of participating governments in OGP? What's the role of civil society organisations around the world? What's the role of donors and multilaterals? How can they help plug the gaps that we clearly have identified? Where does the support unit and IRM come in? What more can we do to support all of you? That's the conversation we want to have throughout the week in Paris. So finally, this summit week in Paris has become much larger than many of us expected. There are many different experiences that people will have by coming to Paris. There is a 2-day academic event. There is a subnational event at City Hall. The National Assembly and the Senate will both be having open parliament events. There'll be over 100 sessions that have been co-created by the community that many of you are leading on. There'll be a high-level opening plenary. There'll be a ministerial event at OECD. There'll be a gathering of climate activists around how we get more environmental governance commitments into OGP. Huge number of things happening all week. And I think we all would have different things we'd like to focus on in this meeting. But if I could ask us, given we just have a short amount of time, is just to really focus over the next 2 weeks, what can we collectively do to ensure that the Paris Summit is collectively a success for all of us? We would very much like to hear your ideas, but I'll stop there. Thanks.
So, how should we do this? So the last part of this session, which is the longest part, is really a roundtable. So we had 3 folks who came prepared with talking about how they're going to use the OGP Summit and what their organization is looking to do. But then we'll turn to questions both online and in the room after that, and be available for any factual, strategic discussions, insights that you have. We very much welcome them. Please, everyone, introduce yourself and the organization that you're from whenever you talk, and I'll try to remind you to do that if you forget. Do we have a volunteer from our... Megan? Okay, great.
All right. I'm Megan Campbell. I'm the Manager of Research and Learning for Feedback Labs. And we're going to be presenting a workshop as part of the subnational stream at the summit on citizen feedback and how and what does it mean to both collect, analyze, but also then act on citizen feedback at a subnational level. And Joe had asked just to kick this off for us to describe what we're trying to get out of the summit, and I think it's exactly what's already been said. With Brexit, with the election of Donald Trump, with the rise of popularity of Marine Le Pen in France, we see that as more than ever a clear signal that we need continual listening to what citizens want, and to us, feedback is an invitation to a conversation between citizens and government elected officials, technocratic experts. It's a conversation. And we think that there needs to be more opportunities for that conversation to be happening, not just in these sort of one-off referendums or every 4-year elections where people get a chance to voice what is obvious frustration and disappointment in a lot of cases. And I thought it was interesting that we saw from this summary here, from what we're learning from OGP, that less than 50% of governments are consulting but don't have any feedback, but don't feed back to the public on what their consultation, what their input led to in terms of changes in what government is doing, and that only 16% of the governments that were surveyed here are collaborating with the public during implementation. And the thing is, that's not surprising because it's really hard to collect feedback. It's really hard to collect it, it's really hard to understand it, and it's incredibly difficult to make decisions differently based on what you hear from citizens. So what we want to get out of this summit is to really understand at a granular level, at a specific level, at an implementation level, what are the barriers that governments are feeling and experiencing in terms of not being able to take that feedback and turn it into different actions, different engagement with citizens. From our experiences, we're finding that a lot of really unsexy topics are important. It's things like procurement. Do you have a flexible enough procurement strategy that you can actually adapt based on the feedback that you're hearing? And so we're interested in this summit in really hearing how much are those challenges shared by all these governments who are attending. What are the challenges that the barriers that are really preventing them from having this meaningful engagement and dialogue, not just collecting of information from citizens, but dialogue with citizens that leads to better governance outcomes. So for us, that's really our desire, our outcome from this summit.
Thanks. Either of you two?
Yeah, we can go down the line. Does that work? Cool. I've never been on a Facebook Live event before. This is really exciting for me. My name is Michael Moses. I'm from Global Integrity. We're based here at the Hub. And in our work, we're all about strengthening the impact and effectiveness of country-level reformers. And I think, as Megan said, particularly given the political climate today across much of the world, that sort of goal is more important than ever. And I think one of the really valuable things about OGP, or the opportunity that it provides, is that it can help open government reformers in the countries that are engaged in OGP learn how to more effectively engage with and shape the political dynamics of reform. And so at the summit, what we're aiming to do is to both support learning about how reformers are already doing that, how are folks leveraging the OGP platform and using that to shape the politics of reform, of governance in their countries. So we want to support, and will be in a variety of sessions, support a bunch of the reformers with whom we work in countries across the world, and sharing how they're going about, in today's difficult political climate, how they're going about leveraging OGP, how they're going about using the opportunities that OGP provides to really make progress on open government reform. And we're also really eager to explore the approaches that are being employed elsewhere, not just in the work that we're supporting, but that the support unit that everyone who's here in the room today and watching online, the sort of work you're doing and your partners in country are doing to really drive progress on reform. So I think the summit, as I said, it's an opportunity both to contribute to learning about how to make progress on reform efforts. It's an opportunity to connect, not just for Global Integrity or for other organizations, international organizations like us, but for the reformers with whom we work at country level. It's an opportunity for us to help them meet and make connections across countries and use their in-country experiences to provide evidence and learning and information that can be useful to reformers in other countries as they try and learn about and adapt to the politics of reform in and across countries. So yeah, I'll leave it there for now. But we have a couple of summits or a couple of sessions at the summit. There's only one summit. And yeah, we're looking forward to being there and to really working on these issues.
Hi everyone, I'm Anusha and I'm with the Accountability Lab. We are, for those of you who don't know about us, we are an incubator for young people. We help them promote and strengthen systems of accountability in their communities through various creative ways. And we are active in Liberia, Pakistan, and Nepal, and right now looking at Mali for expansion. And Liberia, who's been with OGP since 2011, is that good? 2012. It's currently midway through their second National Action Plan, and we've been co-chairing the plan with the Ministry of Information. One of our colleagues on the ground, Francis, has been leading the efforts. And really what we realized is working through our incubator, working with community leaders and change makers, we've realized the real importance of mobilizing civil society and citizens around OGP's commitments and fulfilling them. And the implementation process, that being part of the implementation process in Liberia has made us realize that really having conversations and having dialogue around this, we've recently had a roundtable in Liberia, and bringing people together is incredibly important before we come up with a plan for implementation itself, and really having pulse on what citizens are saying, as Megan mentioned earlier. So for example, in Liberia, we are directly involved with over half of the commitments, including promoting citizen participation. One of the ways we're doing that is by promoting interactive murals, by creating various avenues for connecting with citizens, but accountability film school being one of them, citizen journalism, and other programs to take out corruption, as we say. And the key priority here is to understand what engages citizens, and with that, bringing that back to filling that gap of understanding what works in the higher level from grassroots up. And we've realized that places like the iCampus that we built in Liberia and Monrovia and Ogp Hub, similar to the model here, has been very beneficial. So we're hoping that with the summit, we are able to really understand, besides our role, which has been working closely in civil society, mobilizing the civil society, what else has been working, and also being a primarily youth-focused organization, understanding the role of youth in all of this and youth engagement, and we really want to, we're hosting a panel on youth engagement, and we want to emphasize that young people are important in this whole process. And we also want to learn on a country level and policy level, how can we connect daily conversations to policy. So those are some of the things we hope we can get out of the summit.
Great. All right, well, thank you guys. So we heard about the importance of politics, we heard the importance of feedback, we heard about the importance of youth, but also of kind of movement building and some low-tech solutions. So I think for those of you who've been following OGP for a long time, you can hear some maturation in some of the discussions, just not that you can wave a wand and policies get reformed all the time. So I think that's a really interesting point to take off from, and then should we go to ideas from the room, or do we have questions on Facebook Live? Let's do a few in the room. Points, questions, hopes?
Yeah, sure.
Andrew.
Yeah, I'm Andrew Mendelbaum from Development Gateway. I guess it was great to hear that there was a lot of support from OGP to focus on the implementation phase now of commitments. I think one thing that we've seen in the open contracting field is that there's commitments and there's lots of interest in open contracting and implementing the open contracting data standard, but there's less knowledge within governments about how to do that. There's been more focus at times also on sort of supporting civil society to engage, to lobby for open contracting, but then there's still this gap. So I'm wondering if, and on that note, I mean, we've seen ad hoc support sort of for different initiatives on open contracting or other commitments within different countries. So sometimes, it'll be the government itself, or sometimes there'll be a UNDP mission or in-country or somebody else that's helping to support. And so I'm wondering if there's any sort of active effort to better categorize or understand what types of support are being provided for, particularly, for example, for the major commitments, the STAR commitments, for example, if that's something that's come up or is on the agenda.
Do you want to respond, or do you want to make another comment?
Just respond quickly, because I think this doesn't answer your whole question, but part of the role of this declaration, and the French government were very clear on from the outset, they did not want to have something that was negotiated by 70 countries to a lowest common denominator that everyone can sign up to. They specifically wanted to, in a sense, isolate which are the governments and civil society organizations who are really the trailblazers on each of those different policy areas that are outlined, the 21 that I mentioned. And I think, to your point about implementation support, they are looking for very specific contributions, in particular from governments, who can actually offer expertise to other countries and say, let's take beneficial ownership, for example. The UK government is probably 2 to 3 years ahead of almost any other government in the world in terms of implementing a public register of beneficial ownership. They have built up technical and legal and even to some extent policy expertise on how to do that has now become very valuable for all of the countries in the EU that now have to implement this, and to Kenya, South Africa, Ukraine, a whole set, Norway, a whole set of other countries who are now also looking to implement a public register of beneficial ownership. So there are a couple of dimensions to implementation. I think the one specifically we're trying to get to at the summit is where can we actually get the concrete contributions that help facilitate a race to the top in OGP. There's always this idea of a race to the top. Countries would inspire each other to be more ambitious. We know in practice that happens in a subset of countries, but not as widely as we would like. So how can we actually make that more specific and go issue by issue, identify who is actually leading the way, and what can they offer to the community to pull others up with them. So I'd encourage you in open contracting to see, are there a few countries where the barrier is not so much a political impediment to sign on to some high-level principles, but actually they may be struggling, as you said, on pure implementation. And then how can we use this Paris Declaration to surface the types of countries that will be able to help them do that, so that we broaden the group of people that are assisting, so it's not just the ones that you mentioned.
Other folks? All right, should we go to the internet?
Yes, so we have two questions, one very specific for IRM and one very broad. So one suggestion that was given is to provide both national action plans and progress reports in HTML format. And one of the questions from Alexandros Milidis was, how does the IRM plan to improve readability, accessibility, and making these reports more readable?
Okay, great. So in terms of very practical questions, I can answer those. As we put together a 2017 budget, the hope is that we'll have everything be in the HTML format, or at least the executive summaries in HTML format. The other part is that we hope to make them more closely linked to the database. So when you're looking, for those of you that haven't used the OGP database, it does have 2,500 commitments and growing. Hopefully have some of the assessments in there and some of that assessment material in there so that people can see what the final disposition of those commitments was in OGP. Those will be the two big goals for the next year. In addition to the usual trying to help national researchers to tell the best stories possible about what each commitment is about.
All right, and then we have another question from Stephen Buckley, wondering what constitutes success in Paris.
I would love to open that question up actually to the room and just hear from a few more people, like what, and I really mean what I said at the beginning. Are there things over the next 2 weeks that practically we should be collectively doing to ensure success? I have my version of success, which I can try and answer to Stephen at the end, but it might be more interesting to hear from others.
So Alan from Global Integrity. So quick question, is somebody from the Trump transition team going to be in Paris, or is that entirely unrealistic? So that's what, I've got a couple of others, so whilst you think about that. Second one was, how is climate change featuring on the agenda? Clearly that's, France has been very key to progress on climate change, so how's climate featuring in things? In terms of what's the relationship between the Paris Declaration and the working groups? How do those two things fit together? And then finally, just can you is my understanding right that the steering committee and the leaders of Open Government Partnership at kind of global level are going to be sharing their initial thoughts and reflections on the strategic refresh and the midterm review? Is that the idea?
I don't know about the Trump administration. There may be people in the room who can actually answer that better than me. I would very much welcome them to come, absolutely. If we know people who are going to be working on this agenda, they should absolutely come. They'd be very welcome. So that's, I guess, a question for everyone, if you can help us on that. On the climate angle, so again, I refer back again to the Paris Declaration. There are 4 or 5 climate-orientated collective actions that the World Resources Institute, as our co-chair, who are also very interested clearly in climate, as well as the government of France, they've helped craft those together. I think so far, I don't know what the numbers are, Joe, but it's quite a low number of countries that have used, Heine may even know this better, have used national action plans to address climate change. I think there are some specific areas where we could imagine that the OGP process will actually help ground some of those high-level commitments that were made in Paris last year, and ensure there's national participation in them. So, for example, on release of certain data sets, on participation in national climate plans that COP21 mandated. Those are, it's a frontier area for us. So I think we would be happy if we saw 5 or 6 countries self-identifying themselves as interested in helping to lead a greater focus on climate and environmental governance in OGP. And that will be the success of the summit on climate. In terms of the OGP working groups, for those of you who probably know this, there are 6 OGP working groups on different thematic topics. Some of them are extremely active and are supplying lots of support and learning and technical assistance and so on. Others need a bit of a boost. What we're hoping the declaration will do is breathe new life into the OGP working groups. So almost every collective action listed in the Paris Declaration could fall under an OGP working group. For example, on anti-corruption, I think there are 5 or 6 collective actions in the declaration. We would look to the OGP working groups to take them forward and ensure that what people sign up to in Paris is not just chip paper the next day, or whatever the American equivalent idiom is for that. And then finally on the steering committee and the refresh, absolutely. I think in particular the Civil Society Day and the Government Points of Contact Day, where we'll bring together the lead officials on OGP. We see that as a real core audience for the refresh, because a lot of the findings of the refresh imply a new and more strategic role for civil society and government participating in OGP at the national level. It's the national level where that's where the rubber hits the road of the refresh. It's fine for us to talk about it, but actually it's the implementers in OGP countries where we really need to support them even more intensively to tackle some of the areas coming out of it. So I guess the short answer to that is yes. And I think just to Stephen's question, just while people are thinking, I do think if you step back, the biggest success that we could get, at least from my perspective from Paris, would be to clearly show that there is an alternative movement in the world of people that believe in openness, that believe in basic human rights and freedoms, that believe in civil society's right to participate, to advocate, that we can show that there is an alternative to some of the worrying trends that we've seen. And this is not, by the way, a reflection on what's happened here. It's a much broader thing than that. So I think if we can show there is a movement, a positive movement around openness, that movement still has momentum, that it is achieving practical results on the ground, that it's not just rhetoric, and that we have some really high-level political leadership and statements on this. Beyond getting in the weeds of all the different things that will happen, I think that overarching narrative, for me, certainly would be what success would look like.
Great. Other comments, thoughts? I know people have strong opinions.
I guess just a question, reflection for the group. Earlier, Joe, in your presentation, you mentioned something about, I think it was like smart risk-taking or like positive risk-taking. And I think that's a really powerful idea, given how much emphasis you guys have placed on, moving towards more ambitious commitments. And I guess my question is, in just thinking and working on in a few different ways on kind of innovation processes and things like that, one of the biggest questions, right, is like, how, what are the consequences for failure? Like, because that often shapes people's willingness to take risks, right? So I wonder if there are any interesting examples of, internally kind of within governments, the OGP points of contact, are there times in which folks have maybe tried to step up to the plate to push for more ambition, but maybe, their superiors were not interested or they felt pressure from, external sources or anything like that? Like, I just want to surface that because I think there could be something really valuable in thinking about what do the internal reformers, both within government and civil society, need to be equipped to take on some of that risk that comes with more ambitious reforms.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we try to do in the IRM, but in OGP more broadly, and I hope that the summit is really an opportunity, is to celebrate those people that took the risks. With the Open Government Awards, I think they're pretty strong this year. This year it's on civil society. Other years it's been on the government side. With the START commitments, the IRM is introducing these new reports coming out that look at at the end of the day, did this commitment open government, which is really quite meaningful. So there's the positive side, the carrot side. Whether we've got the balance right, I think we could do more to highlight innovations. I think one of the ways that we really need to do that as an organization, but as a community, is yes, we work on really sometimes what looks like boring reforms, like archives, right? Like archives management. Telling the story of why archives management matters for your country when you don't know who 60% of the public service is, and you're coming out of a civil war and this and that. That's the story that needs to be told a little bit better. And this goes to Joe's point. I know I showed you guys a bunch of bean counting, but on the other side of bean counting, there's the storytelling side. And I hope this summit, more than other ones, can move away from abstractions and political kind of, not political terms, but vague social sciencey terms, and really towards the stories that are out there. I mean, yes, 5% of commitments got a star, but that's 5% of 2,000, which means 100. There's 100 really good reforms out there, which is a lot in so many short years, and we know we're undercounting. We know there's more out there. So, to my mind, that's I would hope makes this summit a little bit different. It's just that people are now coming to the table, hopefully with these reforms and telling them. And on the supply side, just putting those stories in the action plan to begin with. Why are you doing what you're doing? Like I said at the beginning, there's a lot of solutions in search of problems. Let's start with describing the problem and how open government is going to help you solve those. And that will really help. I think that will help us raise the collective ambition and bring people along with you.
Can I jump in there, Joe? So I think you just hit on something that's really important to highlight. I think the potential of OGP, or the value of OGP, isn't just in that it helps people implement commitments, right, or have a successful national action plan, but it provides a structured way through which people can try to implement a reform that, through a multi-stakeholder process, they've agreed, hey, this is important, this is something we want to pursue. And then, ideally, you implement that reform in 2 years, but even if you don't, there's so much that you can learn through the effort of doing that, and so much that you can learn about, okay, so whose support do I need to get in order, or what have you. And OGP provides that platform for the learning that can help you over time get better at implementing that reform, right? So even if you fail in one national action plan, the next one you can try again. You can use the evidence or the lessons that have emerged from your previous experience, and then take another crack at it. And I think conceiving of the partnership in that way, and that it provides a forum for really practical, pragmatic lessons about how to implement reform is really, really valuable. So it's not just the success stories as such, but the learning that can emerge from the whole gamut of OGP experience that's really valuable.
I also wonder, your comment on evidence, I think, is really important. I wonder if it isn't quite important to not just incorporate the stories of success and of learning, but try to quantify the payoff of success. So I think what you're saying, Nita, risk is important as a ratio, like the risk ratio to payoff is what's particularly important. And we see in the feedback discourse all the time, people, governments saying, well, the risks are that we just get a lot of complaints. The risks are that we raise expectations beyond what we can satisfy. But we talk less about what the payoff can be. So, we saw a program in Uganda that incorporated feedback from pregnant mothers on the healthcare they were receiving, and infant mortality dropped by 1/3. I think being able to not just tell the story of that, but to quantify is certainly something that we're hoping to bring, but also collect more of. Collect not just the story of impact, but the tangible improvements that people are seeing based on increases in openness.
Great. Do you have more? Oh, yeah.
It's just my name's Andre, a good friend with the Department of State, and sort of a question for people here, civil society. How, and on feedback, engendering feedback is difficult. It's not just a matter of what do you do with it, but actually getting people engaged outside of the civil society community, where the public is aware of open government and aware of these various things and willing to, and interested in engaging and giving their perspectives. I'm curious for the group, how are you generating grassroots awareness, and are you seeing after 5 years an increase in awareness and an increase in an interest in engaging on open government? It's a question.
I mean, one thing I'll contribute that I'd be interested in hearing from people who work much more closely with governments in particular is what we're seeing is that it's the positive loop and getting into a positive loop that matters. That people, when they can see how their feedback was reflected in an actual decision, where it actually changed behavior of their government in even a small way, I think that makes people sort of more likely to want to participate again. Whereas the experience that a lot of people have on the negative side, where I gave my feedback and nothing was done with it, and we see that just sort of closing off the impetus and the momentum to participate. It's a hypothesis to test through experience that other people have been having.
Is there an increase in feedback or a decrease because of frustration?
I mean, I think I speak for my colleagues on the civil society team, but they've been doing roughly annual surveys, and I think more groups in most countries, there are exceptions, more organized civil society is taking part in the OGP process in these countries, and there's more interest from agencies. We have seen a greater diversity of topic areas covered within action plans. We can quantify that, which suggests that there's broader constituencies. Whether that's reaching the grassroots level, I think you see wide variation in different countries. In some countries, it's quite elite policy process. But in other countries like Chile, they've gone out to each of the 10 regions and organized big public discussions with the general public, or I guess I would say more like community level organizations. And so you see big variation, but I wouldn't say across the board, it's quite made it out of elite policy circles in a lot of countries. And that's something that really thinking about how to get that better, improved in OGP, and that's part of the strategic refresh, is thinking about coalitions. So, okay, fine, you have your national civil rights group working, but then you have the legal clinics, which then connect to the communities, giving feedback into the action plan through that. And what does that look like? Is it something we're still working through? But it's definitely a goal.
Okay, we have a couple more questions from online. One from Nana Norkana, asking about, she said she's still concerned about the concrete results, especially as seen by the everyday citizen, and how does OGP feel for the man on the street? And the other one is from Lorelei Kelly at Georgetown, talking about citizen feedback and citizen feedback labs, and asking if there are any examples of legislatures that are figuring out ways to integrate this feedback into a curated, deliberative policymaking process.
Great. Concrete results. We will have, trying to think, we have a bunch of stories that are coming out. We actually wanted to look at, there's an obvious problem with using the IRM results as a way to measure impacts or what it feels like on the streets, because they only come 1 year into the action plan or 2 years in the action plan, and really it takes much longer for any public policy to roll out. So as part of this, we commissioned 7 what we're calling early results studies, which are really interesting. They're going to be out in 2 weeks in time for the summit. Really looking at, we went back to a bunch of the commitments from 2011 and 2012 to see how, the ones that got completed, how did they roll out on the actual ground, and have they had any results? And I have to say, they are really interesting. There's one on indigenous community consultation in Costa Rica about big issues with land grabs and dam construction there, and so they've finally been able to set up a council by which those communities can participate. There are examples on the cohesion policy in Italy, where they've been tracking where the European cohesion funds for southern Italy have been disappearing, and they've been able to track missing school construction and things like this. So I do think there are many actual real results. Another one in Chile, they passed the lobbying law in their first action plan, and the number of consultations with agencies and people are now, first off, they're now on the books, but a lot of people report that they're actually able to contact their congressman and senator much better now, and that's quantified. So they're actually really interesting. I really recommend people read those when they come out, and I hope we do many, many more in the next few years to figure out whatever happens with these policies once they exist.
Yeah. And at a slightly different level, there will also be a study that Brookings have done that they'll be launching at the summit, where they've been looking at the kind of high-level evidence for the impact of open government reforms. And so that's a paper that will be coming out. They have a high-level panel with various kind of founders of OGP, founding ministers from the Philippines, UK, and a couple of other places. So that session will be live-streamed and is one that I think will be very interesting for people who are coming to attend. And then on the second question, I'm always tempted to ask Andrew, but I think on the parliaments, just more broadly on open parliaments, so there will be again a whole track on open parliaments that will be hosted at the National Assembly by the President of the National Assembly. I think that's the correct position. And NDI are obviously very involved in that, in bringing members of Parliament to the summit. OGP has a new Parliament's policy that was passed in September, which explains the ways in which we're looking for the legislative branch to be more involved in OGP, both in terms of making themselves more open, in terms of consultation around laws, citizen feedback, political party financing, things that directly affect the legislature themselves, but also in terms of the legislature's role in overseeing and providing additional accountability to open government action plans submitted by the executive. So I think we've kind of clarified the kind of way in which the legislative branch and the executive branch will work together under OGP, but there are many examples now of parliaments doing their own open government action plans, and I think we're really looking above all to learn from them about why they did that and what's worked. I don't know, Andrew, if you have any other thoughts. But.
I would just add that one of the things I hope will be on the agenda for the Legislative Openness Working Group will be sort of discussing, how these efforts have gone. There have been petition efforts, for example, in Finland, which was really in the lead for quite a while on taking petitions. At one point, a number of their petitions were shelved because there was a new legislature, and they decided to shelve them before the end of the session. So it'll be interesting to hear any updates on that, and also just if they've made any progress on consultation processes. A lot of governments have been sort of in the lead on consultation processes until now, partially because legislatures, although they're supposed to be the representative body, are also filled with people from different parties, and that has tended to make the consultation process more difficult in some ways, at least in terms of giving the parliament as an institution a role in that process. But there are places where a lot of work has been going on, Scotland, Serbia, for example. So it'll be great to hear what these countries have been up to, what kind of progress they've made.
I think Macedonia Action Plan has some notice and comment reforms in their action plan. I'm looking at my team. Is there any other countries that you guys for people to check out who are interested in this?
Chile.
Yeah, I think the ones that come straight to mind are Macedonia, and Chile. All right, but we are at time, so we'll stop here and take it to the hallways. But thank you everyone for coming. I'm very excited about the summit. It's going to be extremely busy. I hope you all get out of it more than you ever expected, and you have even new and more ambitious definitions of success. So thank you very much.